I'm Stephanie Wilson, and you're listening to Freedom Over Fascism. Hi, friends. As part of the Democracy Group podcast network, I interviewed Ben Rhodes, former aide to Barack Obama, author, national security expert, and co-host of the podcast Pod Save the World. Kami Kovan, managing director of the USC Center for the Political Future, was my co-interviewer for the session. His center's podcast is Let's Find Common Ground. We had a wide-ranging conversation with Rhodes about the state of democracy, how bad things really are, and what we can be doing to oppose this and other authoritarian regimes. We recorded this on May 22nd at the USC Capitol campus in Washington, D.C. I hope you enjoy the conversation.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Jenna Spinelli. I'm the founder of the Democracy Group Podcast Network, which is the organizer of tonight's event and part of the McCourtney Institute for Democracy at Penn State University. We are so thrilled to be here at the USC Capitol campus for tonight's conversation with Ben Rhodes on America's changing role in a changed world. So the Democracy Group is a network of about 18 podcasts, all devoted to democracy, civic engagement, and civil discourse. You might have already learned a little bit about us when you were registering for tonight's event, but if you haven't, I encourage you to check out our member shows, many of whom are in the room tonight, so they would be happy to tell you all about their podcasts if they haven't already. And tonight's conversation will be recorded and put out as a live, as a recording on the Democracy Group's podcast feed, as well as I hope on some of our member shows as well. So stay tuned for all of that. You can sign up for the Democracy Group's newsletter to be notified when that is made available. I'd also like to thank the Louis Raikin Foundation for the funding to support tonight's event and to help us bring Ben in for this conversation. So we have quite the lineup for you here on stage. Two of the hosts will be leading the conversation. Let me introduce them before I introduce the main speaker as well. So seated furthest from me is Kami Kovan, who is managing director of the USC Dornsife Center for the Political Future, and one of the reasons we're all sitting here today at USC. So thank you, Kami, for the connection there. The center's podcast is Let's Find Common Ground, and it's hosted by veteran political strategist Mike Murphy and Bob Sherm. Kami is the former CEO of Procon.org, the nation's leading source of nonpartisan research on controversial issues. He writes and speaks on numerous topics, including the origins of and solutions to political polarization, improving interpersonal communication, the power of debate, civics education, and how to teach controversial issues. And then seated in the middle is Stephanie Gerber Wilson, the creator of Freedom Over Fascism, which is a podcast and Substack that you should all subscribe to. She has more than 25 years of strategic communications experience, including positions as the director of communications for a state representative and co-founder of a nonprofit to strengthen democracy in Indiana. She holds a PhD in history, and her research focused on how present-day ideology reflects understanding of the past. And last, but certainly not least, we have Ben Rhodes. Ben is a writer, political commentator, national security analyst, and a fellow podcaster. He is the author of the New York Times bestsellers After the Fall, Being American in the World We've Made, and The World as It Is, a memoir of the Obama White House. He is co-host of Pod Save the World, and his work has been published in outlets including The Atlantic, The Washington Post, The New York Times, and Foreign Affairs. From 2009 to 2017, he served as a speechwriter and deputy national security advisor to President Obama. In that capacity, he participated in all of President Obama's key decisions, oversaw President's national security communications and public diplomacy, and led secret negotiations with the Cuban government that resulted in the effort to normalize relations between the U.S. and Cuba. So quite the panel we have for you today. With that, I will turn it over to Kami to kick things off. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Jenna, for a very generous introduction. We are thrilled to have all of you join us here today. Before I get started, let me just ask, how many folks in the room are USC alum or USC affiliated? There's the fight on hands. All right, good to see you. Good to see so many old friends and new friends. How many of you are listeners of the Ben Rhodes great podcast, Pod Save the World? Oh, look at that. Most of the hands in the room went up for that. That's good.
Don't ask about my podcast.
Well, we're thrilled that you're all here, folks, and are very grateful to the Democracy Group Podcast Coalition for putting on today's event. And you are going to be able to hear this later and rekindle the tremendous memories that you're going to form tonight when you listen to this podcast on Democracy Group, including on the Center for the Political Futures podcast, Let's Find Common Ground, and Stephanie Wilson's Freedom Over Fascism. The gist of the questions that we're going to go over today are roughly in three areas. Number one is, what the hell is going on? Number two is, how bad is it really? And number three is, what can realistically be done about that? So thanks to Stephanie, I have the privilege of asking question number one. And the question is really, it's a follow-up from your book, Ben, which is, what is the state of democracy globally? Have you seen their strength rising or falling since you wrote your brilliant book After the Fall? And what is driving those changes?
Yeah, well, look, it's great to be here. We flew all the way across the country to have a conversation in Washington. It's funny. My last book was about essentially the authoritarian playbook. I think the jumping off point for me was I wanted to profile different authoritarian playbooks around the world, and one of them was going to be Viktor Orban's in Hungary. And I met a young Hungarian anti-corruption activist. And there's a lot of corruption in Hungary, so he had a lot of work to do. And I said to him, how did Viktor Orban transform your country from a liberal democracy to essentially a single party kind of soft autocracy in a decade? And he said, well, that's simple. Orban got elected in a right-wing populist backlash to the financial crisis and globalization. He packed the courts in Hungary with far-right judges who would find in favor of his power grabs. He redrew the parliamentary districts to entrench his party in power and delegitimize his opposition. He changed the voting laws to make it easier for his supporters to vote, harder for his opponents to vote. He enriched some cronies through corruption, who then financed his politics. He changed the civil society laws to punish civil society that he didn't like and favor civil society that he did. He had people buy up the media and turn it into kind of right-wing propaganda. He used social media to kind of demoralize his opponents and troll them. And he wrapped it all up in an us versus them message. Us, the real Hungarians, against them, the immigrants, the Muslims, the liberal elites, George Soros. And this was in 2019. And I remember thinking, well, that sounds familiar. And the reason I say that is that we had these conversations about whether there's democratic backsliding. It's already happened. Like, we are on the other side of democratic backsliding in this country and around the world. The predominant trend in global politics is towards this kind of corrupt, transactional, strongman politics. Trump is actually very aligned with the direction of politics in the world, more so than his opponents in this country. Some of that is because of Trump, and some of that is because of how Trump has stepped into like what was already a trend. And I think that the why I would just say is that I do think that there were these body blows to the system of globalization, the financial crisis prominent among them, where people fundamentally lost faith in the systems that were governing their lives. And they looked to the far right for a populism that was a familiar identity for them, right? The ultimate, most traditional form of politics is kind of tribal identity politics, us versus them politics. And so that the kind of anger and sense of backlash was captured by a certain flavor of, I'd say, far right politics and large parts of the world. At the same time that the Chinese model, which is different, and is obviously rooted in a different tradition, was gaining traction in parts of the developing world as, well, wait a second, maybe that's a better way for us to organize our societies than what the Americans have been selling all these years. And so those two forces within democracies, this kind of state capture is happening at the same time that the Chinese are also offering an alternative model that is also gaining traction. And there's kind of been this almost convergence in the sense that the enemy of both those forces is liberal democracy. And liberal democracy and liberal Democrats, when I say liberal, I don't necessarily mean left, I just mean liberal, we're kind of made to wear the clothes of globalization, even though we weren't responsible for a lot of things that made people angry. I would actually argue that the right was more responsible for certainly, open free trade agreements and the Iraq War and some of the things that obviously generated anger. We, as the defenders of democracy, became defenders of a system that had lost a constituency.
So, so this is a worldwide trend, and you talked about both the Orban model and the Chinese model. But there have been several elections in the last couple of weeks. Do any of the elections, which seem to show some sort of backlash, at least against Trump, does that change the calculus in any way?
It does a little bit. And I should say, like, what's interesting about this model is that, actually, I taught a class at USC a few years ago where each week we did a different autocrat. And it was meant to go through how the playbooks are similar, but slightly different flavors. And we did Orban, Putin, Trump. We also did Modi and Netanyahu and Erdogan and Bolsonaro, right? And the reason that's important is that that's global. That's not just Europe and the US, right? That's in every part of the world. And we did the Chinese. So we did 8 autocrats. I say that to make the point that we have to understand this as a global phenomenon that takes a certain form in, the US and Europe. What I'd say is, if you look at the recent elections, what I find hopeful about them, and I'll highlight 3 of them, Canada, Australia, and Romania. And really, I think Canada and Australia are the most analogous to the United States, is that, sure, some of that was in Canada, they didn't want to get invaded and annexed. And so, they kind of stood up behind the person that was most aggressively challenging that, in Mark Carney. But I think more interestingly, in both Canada and Australia and in Romania, you had very kind of Trump adjacent people running for office, right? Pierre Poilievre in Canada had kind of taken on some of that strongman, in a very Canadian way, but he was not a conventional Canadian conservative. He was more of a, shake it up, anti-system guy, and got a lot of traction out of the kind of anti-lockdown movements, right? And COVID obviously played a big role in this. And I think part of what informed Canadians and Australians, based on some of my conversations, is not just fear of Trump, but fear of selecting a Trump-like person. Like, oh, wait a second, do we really want to do this? Looks pretty chaotic in the United States. That looks kind of scary what's happening in the United States. And so I do think there's a bit of a reconsideration. I'm angry. I'm actually pretty angry at these center left or social democratic parties, but maybe this isn't the answer. So I don't take those victories as big validations of kind of my brand of social democratic global politics, but I do take them as a sign that people are looking at this and thinking, maybe we don't want to do this. And if there's one to kind of hint at the second, category, and maybe the third, the first time we did not get the full Trump experience. We got Donald Trump's Twitter feed, and we got a pretty conventional Republican administration, right? So you've got Reince Priebus and John Kelly, chiefs of staff, and Mattis and Tillerson at Defense and State, and H.R. McMaster at NSC, and you got a big tax cut written by members of Congress. This time around, the government is not those people. This time around, it's the full Trump experience. And it's the full authoritarian playbook. It's targeting law firms and universities and civil society. It's widespread corruption as a norm. it's bullying of the media, it's, hounding of political opponents. And so we're going to get the full experience this time. And that full experience is more likely, we didn't get a swing back. I mean, I don't think Joe Biden would have won the last election absent a pandemic. Even with that, he barely eked out a victory. It wasn't like a correction. And if we can withstand 4 years, and I'm obviously speaking from a partisan perspective here, I think the possibility of a swing in a different direction in this country and in other parts of the world is much greater than last time, because we're going to go through the full experience. The question is, are we still here after that experience?
Right. Will it be too little, too late? And to the extent of the whether you see it as a good or a bad of that full experience, can we recover from it? And I'm thinking specifically about something I've heard folks talking about. Our international agreements. It's looking at long-standing alliances through organizations like NATO and seeing those kinds of large party alliances be less relevant, if at all relevant, than bilateral agreements that are brand new and being forced to be re-examined and re-engineered and renegotiated. And I wonder, from your point of view, whether or not those kinds of bilateral agreements can achieve what the Trump administration hopes they can achieve, where we can, in his view, correct some historic wrongs against the United States and balance the playing field, or is it doing major damage to international alliances and not helping our foreign policy at all?
I think what's interesting to me about Trump is that, I share some of his diagnosis of the creakiness and outdated nature of the international system, and of aspects of U.S. foreign policy, particularly kind of U.S. interventionism. My diagnoses just lead in a completely different direction than his. But I mean, he is like a hurricane that's going to come through and blow all the houses down, and we're going to have to rebuild from a new place. And I guess what I'd say is that, Trump has been a massive accelerant. The U.S.-led order, rules-based order, when I was in the White House for 8 years, you could feel it. The seams were popping on it. The Russians were trying to destroy it. The Chinese were trying to build their alternative to it. It was increasingly the U.S. and kind of our like-minded countries, global South countries, were kind of shopping. On some issues, we work with the Chinese, on others with the Americans. Trump has been a massive accelerant to that just kind of coming apart. And I don't think in 4 years it's going to be there in any way that is recognizable to us even today, right? There may be a NATO on paper, but it's not going to be the same, center of activity in security space between the U.S. and other. We may very well annex NATO territory from Greenland in the next 4 years, right? So this is going to change. In terms of the bilateralism, I mean, I think what Trump is he's entirely, and those of you who listen to the podcast know I'm not just coming up with this take after the recent trip he went on. I've been saying this for a while, he's an entirely transactional person, and he wants a transaction to be between two parties. That both makes it very easy for him to serve his own personal interests, financial interests, and I don't think you can underestimate the importance of those. And there's plenty of evidence. This is not an alarmist thing. You've got Emiratis paying $2 billion for Trump coin, the Qataris gifting an Air Force One, Eric Trump going to Vietnam, which is under threat of tariff, and collecting over $1 billion for Trump properties. This is happening. This is not me surmising it's happening. But also I think he fundamentally believes that we can kind of pressure these countries into buying more of our stuff, and that will have a positive benefit. I don't think that's the case, because there are alternatives for these countries. And sure, they'll try to manage through Trump, but they'll hedge in the direction of China, I think, in particular, in the medium and long term. And so they'll kind of try to keep Trump at bay over here, give Eric Trump $1 billion for some Trump coin. I think tonight there's a dinner that people had to pay a certain amount of money of Trump meme coins to have dinner with them. That kind of stuff will be happening. They may agree to buy more of our, widgets. But they're going to start to realign some of their trade and supply chains away from the U.S. to China or other places. So I think if we get to the other side of this, and whether it's a Democrat or even a Republican, I mean, because I actually don't think, I mean, Trump is pretty distinct. There's going to be a hollowed out government, right? We don't have a development agency. We're shedding personnel across the US government. We won't have these alliances in the same way. The opportunity in that is to build them differently. And I think where I've been critical of the Democratic Party, including the Biden administration, is there was kind of this desire to run it back, like play the old hits, like talk about NATO a lot, that's not where anybody is, and so some of the young people in the room who I was talking to, like, when I was a young person going into this field in Washington, 25 years ago, I was going to operate within a set of institutions. Young people today are going to have to actually imagine a new U.S. government and a new set of international institutions, and a new set, and I believe a new set of negotiations with the Chinese and other countries about what international order replaces ours on climate, on technology, on nuclear weapons, on the main issues. We're going to have to renegotiate the terms of international order.
So I've been thinking a lot about lately, and one of my recent interviews was talking about imagination and how we have to kind of bypass the limits of what has been to create something new. What do you think that beyond college students and lone voices here and there is enough energy toward creating something new if we get through the next several years to create both a new beneficial United States and international order?
Yeah, I think there has to be, like, it's a necessity. I mean, this system, this society that we're living in is just kind of not working like it should. And I think we're kind of all aware of that, I think we all have friends or family members who work more than one job and like literally cannot get by, right? I think we see billionaires and tech companies becoming more and more powerful while people feel less and less empowered. I think we're looking at a world order in which we are tolerating a degree of risk, not to use like a financial term, but like there's wars going on all over the world right now. Like there's a major war in Europe right now. There's a major war in the Middle East. There's a war waiting to happen in the Taiwan Strait. Like there's just, this is not sustainable, right? This model, and to kind of jump ahead to the alarmism, usually there's like a world war that happens.
That was going to be my next question.
And then we rebuild the system. And, or there's like a Great Depression scale kind of financial crisis, and then we do a New Deal, and so I think that feeling that we all have is of foreboding. Even Trump voters, who kind of see Trump as a disruptive event that might get us to some different future. We are in an age of disruption right now. Like the question is that like the 1930s or like the early 20th century before something really bad happened? Or can we kind of manage through it without that shock to get to the other end? Either way, we are going to have to reimagine what American identity is. We're going to have to, it's not sustainable to just have this big of a different disagreement about who is American and what it means to be American. We're going to have to reimagine an economy with AI, poised to do massive job displacement. We're going to have to reimagine a social safety net that can exist in a world in which people can expect to work one job their whole lives. These things, and we're going to have to reimagine how countries interact at a time when China is going to rise and already has. And there's increasing centers of power around the world. And so to me, the question is not whether that will happen. It's whether that will only happen after it gets much, much worse, or whether we can kind of be on a plane that's going through a bunch of turbulence until we kind of hit like some clear air.
Well, you talk about a lot of the, maybe there's opportunity in chaos, and maybe there's a lot of dysfunctional systems anyway. I mean, who is happy with income inequality gap and all these other things that we can point to and say, things weren't good then either, right? And so you said he's going to come and the hurricane will destroy all the houses. So, and I also hear what you're saying, Stephanie. You're saying that you asked about opportunity and whether there's hope and optimism, and you're saying, Ben, that maybe necessity is the mother of invention.
Not hope or optimism, but creativity and ingenuity,
right?
and imagination.
And maybe it comes from necessity, like you're saying. What I wanted to understand a little more closely is the global backlash to what Trump is doing from other countries who are looking at these other alternatives. They're looking at China. They're looking at authoritarian regimes and thinking, maybe, like you said, shopping around. The global backlash to Trump, I wonder how much of that is going to stick to the United States, regardless of who is the next leader. Is it an anti-Trump sentiment, or is it turning into an anti-American feeling? And regardless of which one you think it is, how do you think that affects our national security and our global power?
Yeah, I want to say I'm going to try to appeal to your common ground work. One, I don't know if it's hopeful, but one opportunity is, it's kind of interesting to me. There's an element of the Trump voter that I share a lot of their critiques. Not the ones that I think become more identity-based or racialized, but the ones that are like, these systems don't work. So let's just try. I understand the Obama-Trump voter. That makes total sense. Like we ran, the campaign, if you think about every election since like George Bush's reelection in 2004, was somebody running and saying, this whole system is totally broken and we need change. And that was Obama in 2008, that was Obama in 2012, and that was Trump in 2016. And Joe Biden was, again, that was a kind of weird election, right? But the point is that like one consistent message American voters are delivered is, we don't like this system, and they don't like income inequality, and they don't I'll spare you the, complaining of like, well, Trump's not the answer to that. But anyway, that's a hopeful point. In terms of the system, as I travel a lot around the world, I engage a lot with people internationally in politics and civil society. And I can tell you that it is going to stick to the United States this time. And what everybody said to me in the first Trump term is like, we're waiting to see if this is an aberration. But when you do it twice, when you select this, knowing he said what he was going to do. Everything he's done, with some weird eccentric exceptions, he ran on mass deportations. He ran on tariffs. So people might have thought, well, he's not actually going to do that. But if you're in one of these other countries, just to kind of give you a few examples, Denmark. No ally has done more for Ukraine in terms of as a proportion of their military than Denmark. They gave all of their shells to Ukraine, all of them, 100% of the kind of short-range artillery that is sustaining that fight, only to then find the United States wanting to, whatever you think of Denmark's claim on Greenland, have their ally that asked them to do that now wanting to take their territory. And that's, all the European countries feel like this rug pull has happened to them. How'd you like to be African and watch that spectacle in the Oval Office yesterday, where the president of South Africa has to sit there and have like a presentation made to him about like white genocide that is just not happening? What message are you going to take from that? We have these debates in this country, like, oh, is Trump racist or not? Like, that's not a real question for people in South Africa today, is it? And that's something that is seen not just by South Africans, it's seen across that continent. If you are in Vietnam and you literally did free trade agreements with the United States, and we encouraged you to reshore the production of Apple Watches and Nike shoes from China to Vietnam as part of our strategy of dealing with China, and then you get a 49% tariff put on you because of the trade deficit, because you do the things that we asked you to do. These countries don't believe that they can rely on us, and they think we're totally hypocritical. Like I said, we're not going to see, like, what is hard to explain to people is, of course, their leaders come and they try to say nice things to Trump. That does not mean that that's what they're saying when they go home. And so what it's going to mean is, I think you're going to have, if you look at what China's done economically, they're ahead of us on clean energy. They have their own AI. Like they have all the critical minerals that sustain certain important supply chains on energy and medicine and other things. Like these countries are just going to start to kind of reallocate their economies in the direction of China, or the Europeans will look to India, or they'll form alternative trading blocks. They'll start to de-dollarize. I mean, not to be too nerdy here, but like the dollar is a reserve currency. You want to know how we're allowed to run up trillions of dollars in debt? It's because other countries buy U.S. treasuries. And like the trade deficits that Trump complains about, that's our credit card. The trade deficit is a credit card. It's what allows us to consume more than we produce. And if these countries move away from the dollar, that could all fall apart for us. And suddenly you think standards of living aren't good in this country now? Like wait until that happens, right? And so what I worry about is this kind of realignment of the global economy and geopolitics that is not going to be evident next year. And like this is, as a Democrat, like we came in after the financial crisis, the next president is going, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, is going to inherit this. And it's not going to be pretty.
So given this, how do you see what if we separate domestic policy and foreign policy, which we really can't, but if we were to, what would the United States, assuming we got, less crazy, need to do in order to build up trust again from our present, former allies?
Yeah, I think, and first of all, the reason the U.S. will never, even 5 years, 10 years, we're still going to be really important. Our military is so far ahead of anybody else's, our global presence, our innovation, like there are going to be assets that we have as we reimagine this future. I think that, and I was talking to some Democrats about this today, but like, first of all, I think we have to eliminate the artificial barrier between domestic and foreign policy. It's been very bad, I think, for the United States and for the Democratic Party in particular, that it's like, well, we have these things, we talk about things a certain way at home, and then there's this whole other language we speak abroad, and this whole other set of issues. No, I actually think that the basic things that people, the small d Democrats should care about in this country should guide our approach to the world. We believe, and actually Trump has helpfully clarified, when you fall back and you peel the whole system back, what do we really want and need? We need laws. We need rules that people follow, and not rules that only apply to some people. And if you're Elon Musk, there are no rules that apply to you, right? We need fairness. Like this is a word I keep trying to like introduce more, in a sense of fairness. People don't think that this economy in this country is fair. Countries around the world don't think that the system around the world is fair. We need to see diversity as a fundamental strength of the United States. And this is an argument that, I'm sorry, like Democrats are going to have to make and not hide from. And that doesn't mean, woke ideology. It just means saying the fact that the world is globalized, the fact that we are comprised of people who come from every part of the world is a huge advantage for us. Like everybody's here, like somebody is here from everywhere or in the world. And that is good for us. That makes us smarter. That makes us more interesting. Imagine how boring our culture would be if it was just white people in this country. Like
they're running our largest businesses.
Yeah. Look who's running. My one private sector thing is with Microsoft. Satya Nadella is like the best tech CEO. And so the point is that we have to kind of defend these basics of, if we want a system where everybody follows the same rules, everybody's treated fairly, and diversity is a good thing. That's how I would like distill my worldview. And that can inform your domestic politics, and it needs to inform your foreign policy. And we have to kind of go the extra mile to treat people fairly and to treat people with respect and to respect the diversity of their systems and beliefs, and to follow rules instead of, as the United States has done for a long time, say that there's one set of rules for every country in the world. They usually don't apply to us.
Well, let me ask a question that maybe touches on some issues of fairness, and I want to pivot to the Middle East, and I will not ask you about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I won't ask you about the U.S.
You can
relation
if you want. But
with Saudi Arabia. I won't even ask you about Qatari jets. What I'm curious about is Syria. You called balls and strikes on that one and said credit to the Trump administration for some action in Syria. I'm wondering if you can explain what it was that you thought was a win for the United States with Syria policy.
Yeah, well, this is actually a good example of the kind of opening, like using a different kind of imagination and treating people fairly. So, I mean, the short version is, right, like the U.S. has a massive amount of sanctions that were put in place on Syria when Assad was president. We sanctioned the Assad regime for being a murderous dictatorship that was imprisoning its own people. And even the name of the legislation, the Caesar Act, is named after a photographer who smuggled out thousands of pictures from inside Syria's military prisons. We have a insurgency that successfully ousts the Assad regime. It is led by someone who fought with al-Qaeda in Iraq and was, in league with every form of extremist group in Syria, as would anybody who is in the Syrian opposition be. Anybody who tells you differently, like I read all the intel, like there was not some, when you're fighting a dictator, you don't ask the person next to you, whether they're an ISIS or not. You just fight with them. And this guy has basically tried to say the right things and do the right things since he's become the de facto leader of Syria, Ahmed al-Shara, or not de facto, he's the leader of Syria now. And yet, the Biden administration kept all the sanctions in place, and we're like, well, we're going to use those as leverage, to pressure them to make sure that they're, treating everybody fairly and they're pluralistic and they're democratic and all these things. To me, that's insane because, first of all, if those sanctions are in place, not $1 of investment can go into Syria, not $1. This is a country in which 90% of the people are in extreme poverty. A lot of the infrastructure is destroyed. And there are Gulf Arabs who are ready to write really big checks to fix all that stuff. Qatar was willing to pay the salaries of everybody in the Syrian government, but they couldn't because of U.S. sanctions. And the reason that people don't do this is they're afraid. Well, what if I get criticized because this guy was once in al-Qaeda? Or what if 5 years from now he ends up being a bad guy and then they'll say, why did you do this? This is the kind of mindset in the American national security establishment that drives me absolutely insane. Because you put sanctions in place for a reason, that reason is fulfilled. And if we wait for Syria to be a democracy to lift the sanctions, we are not a democracy 250 years after we founded this whole experiment. Like, you could find a reason to sanction us for some of the stuff that's happening in this country right now. So it's an insane criteria. And I think with the opportunity Trump presents is he's not, and again, I don't like most of what he does, but on that one, he was right. It's the right thing. Why are we sanctioning these guys? Let's meet this guy. Let's try to help him succeed and be the better version of himself. Let's not hold him to some standard where the country has to look like, name it, Switzerland or something. This is the real world, and we should want to help this guy succeed. And I mean, like you mentioned, Cuba is still in my bio, but that's another example. How are those sanctions? The most sanctions countries in the world by the United States are Cuba, Venezuela, North Korea, and Iran. Is that working? Have those countries become more like we would like them to be during the course of those sanctions or not? And so I think part of what Trump has to do, when I challenge the people in the national security establishment, you guys just got to let go of, well, we've always done it this way. And you've got to let go of this constant fear of being called weak or being, and yes, I mean, it's easier for Trump because the bad faith right-wing attacks don't come his way in the way that they would. But guess what? If you just do what you believe in, people will follow you. If you look like you're afraid to do it, then they're going to smell that too. And I think that's a lesson we can take, is just we can do things differently than we did them in the past and not be afraid to do that.
So you said to do things that we believe in. Do you but also that Trump is a very transactional guy. What do you think the Trump administration actually believes in? and how would that play out because of all of the corruption and transactionalism and all of the things that holds it back and contributes to the foreign policy?
Yeah, it's a really important and good question. I mean, because Trump is kind of an interesting mashup of a few ideological strains, right? There's a kind of Stephen Miller ethno-nationalism, right? Which is essentially, we believe in reversing diversity, not just stopping, migration across the southern border. As we've seen, like they are, and again, to bring facts to this, so it's not just me, they are literally deporting Black and brown people to places as far-flung as El Salvador, Libya, and South Sudan, while welcoming Afrikaner refugees. Like that's what Stephen Miller believes in, right? He believes in altering the demographics of this country through immigration policy, right? And that interacts enough with Trump's own impulses that is a core project of the Trump administration's. Then there's a kind of Project 2025, like long-standing, long-building, like right-wing project to dismantle essentially the administrative state, to really, really shrink the federal government, and to deregulate. Because the fundamental idea is that this is a form of liberal social engineering, and we can't fix it. We just have to wipe it out. And oh, by the way, that serves the interest of wealthy people, tech companies, fossil fuel companies, in addition to kind of being in the ideological wheelhouse of people who just don't like government, right? And that's clearly another part of their project. There's also clearly a sense that a certain kind of dissent is not welcome in this country, right? We don't want law firms representing certain causes or people. They haven't come for civil society yet, but I think they will. We don't like certain kinds of civil society. We don't want universities to be incubators for certain ideas that we don't like. And that kind of grows out of the Project 2025 piece too. But Trump clearly likes that too, because those people also happen to be people who criticize him or come after him. And so with Trump, and then Trump himself is, I mean, I went back actually for the book I'm working on now, and I read his entire Trump Tower speech when he announced his campaign for president in 2015. It's a pretty fascinating thing to read, because the number one topic he discusses is tariffs and trade deficits. We've been getting ripped off, and he attacks Japan at length. I mean, it's, as a New Yorker who came of age in the 80s, like it's very familiar to me. It's like that the Japanese don't buy American cars, but he believes the tariff thing. And I think that's like a particular Trump flavor. And so I think you have to see it as, if you add like the kind of Stephen Miller, tech, heritage, Trump, where those circle overlap is the Trump project, And I know that's like a long-winded answer. It'd be easier to just say like he's an ethno-nationalist who believes X. But I think Trump believes in his own power. Trump believes in power for power's sake. If you have power, you are aggrandized, you are enriched, and all these other things are means for me to have more power. If I control who's in this country, if I can control the global economy with the turning of the dial on tariffs, if I can shut down law firms that come after me, all those things are in service of him having power, while also serving some of these other ideological projects to kind of feed into that. And that's what's kind of peculiar about Trump and how you have to think of it that way. I do worry about where that Trump is actually not an uncommon character in history. Like most of human beings have been governed by people like Trump for most of humanity. That kind of power does usually lead towards territorial expansionism. And so this focus on Greenland and Panama and even Canada,
Gulf of America.
Gulf, was not at all surprising to me, because I think a Trump would like to say, I made the United States bigger, So I also think that even though his foreign policy is not usually interventionist, this territory aspect as we get later in the Trump term, I'd watch that space, because he's going to want to leave with like a bigger map of America that he came in. All these guys do, Putin's like that, and so that's a kind of an eccentricity of, I think, this second Trump term.
Well, our goal in the conversation was to talk about what the heck is going on. I think you've given us some really good insights on that. We talked about how bad is it really, and got some great insights on that. Well, maybe we can pivot to something that's not such a bummer and see if there's some hope here. And what I wanted to focus on really was, I'm talking about me as a driver. I live in Los Angeles, as you do, Ben. And I listen to audiobooks and podcasts in the car. And when I hear someone's voice in my car that's just 2 feet from my head, it feels like this person is very familiar to me. You seem very familiar to me because I listen to your podcast, and I feel like you're on my carpools with me. I feel that way about many of the books and podcasts that I listen to. I wanted to ask you about podcasts specifically. Like, is there some power to that platform, that medium, that form of communication that makes it feel like we have a relationship with the speakers? What is the magic of podcasts? Why are they so popular today?
Yeah, and I want to make sure I'm like not depressing people too much, in the sense that, because like if we can avoid the worst outcome, this will have served a real purpose. Yeah, like this was not sustainable. This month, globalization, the liberal order as it was for 80 years, and this is going to get to podcasts. Like, there was going to have to be a disruption. Like, and now it's happening, and we have an opportunity. I think it's kind of interesting to think about, hey, USAID is great, but like, it's actually kind of not how I design things. Like, what's a new international development agency look like? Like there are all kinds of things like that where I actually think if we can come out of the disruption, minimizing damage, this could actually be a huge opportunity, to, instead of renovating a house that's falling down, to just rebuild, right? And actually that does relate to podcasts, because another thing I'm hopeful about is, in not to play the role of a grieved author, but I'm going to do it. When my last book came out, the most common thing I got was like, well, that's kind of depressing, man. That's kind of dark. And why didn't you give it? You worked for Obama. Like, well, I thought there's gonna be more hope in this book, And it was a hard conversation to have about like this authoritarianism is everywhere. You gotta understand the hope. People know what the hell is going on now. Like, maybe they don't know what the hell's going on, but they know that shit is going on now. Like, people are aware that this is different. This is not normal. Some people like it. If you like Trump, you're excited about it. Some people are really scared. Some people are angry. But there's no need to convince somebody that these are unusual times, And that leads to the podcast point. I think people desperately want to unpack what is happening, I actually do listen to a lot of like, NBA podcasts. Unfortunately, my Knicks didn't, I don't want to talk about last night. But so this obviously, like in any format, podcasts allow for a level of intimacy and familiarity with the host. You're listening in on a conversation. What I always tell other podcasters is, we're not there to like tell people things. You want someone to just think that they happen to be overhearing you having a conversation with somebody. But also what it's allowing for is, like, as someone, not to be critical of one of my other employers, but as someone who's an MSNBC contributor, my ability to kind of like have a conversation on what's happening in a 2-minute interjection on MSNBC is so minimal compared to like being able to unpack issues, draw connections, let something breathe, simultaneously make light of something while also being very serious about something. I think podcasts both provide the kind of intimacy that particularly younger people who grew up with social media expect from their media. They expect it to be more curated. Like, it's not just like, I'm going to watch the evening news and read this newspaper. I'm going to curate my experience, and I want to curate these people's voices. But at a time in politics and democracy space, at a time when people really don't know what's going on, again, I'm sorry to be critical, but like, you would not be able to figure out what's going on if you watch CNN or MSNBC. Like, in the same way that if you listen to like a podcast, it's like, oh, these people can draw the connections, and these people, and maybe in my head, I'm arguing with these people sometimes. Like, sometimes people will say, well, I really disagreed with you on that one thing. I'm like, if you agreed with everything I said, that'd be kind of weird, like, so I also think in podcasts, you get to know these people and you kind of, I don't like your take on that. And you're kind of interacting with it, And so I think podcasts are part of this answer because people are looking, for my book that I'm writing now, I studied the Lyceum movement, which is like where basically speakers would travel around the country, right? Frederick Douglass, most famously. And they were like the pop stars of their time. Like they'd show up in town and they'd give a lecture on something and everybody would come and listen to the lecture. And then people would then go have sessions where they talk about it, And a guy like Frederick Douglass would give like 150 speeches in a year, right? And it makes sense, actually. They weren't pop stars back then. There was no amplified music. But in a weird way, podcasts are a version of a deep American tradition of like lengthy discussion and debate of topics of interest. And actually, interesting, Lyceum wasn't just politics. It was culture and sports and other things too. And so I think that there's something pretty American in this idea of like, I want to select different people who I want to hear what those people have to say. And then I want to go talk to my friends about what I heard on that podcast.
So, okay. So what else? Talking in this deep conversation, being an American way, what is also deeply American is a deep division in American society. And it seems that one side has this set of podcasts. One says, this is your dance space. This is my dance space. And there's no overlap. How do you get past the different realities that people live in, given the different information that they take in? Sorry, that's not hopeful.
I don't have the answer to that question. And I think it's when I wrote my last, I shared it with Obama and he read it. He's like, oh, that's pretty dark. And he was like, but Ben, what's different? I mean, there's always been a struggle between democracy and authoritarianism. There's always been, all these forces. What is distinct about now? And I thought about it and I was like, what's different about now is technology and social media, sorting people into these different information systems and different belief systems fundamentally. And I said to him, I was like, I always was struck by the fact that more people thought Obama was born outside the United States at the end of his presidency than the beginning. QAnon was impossible in 2008. Like the idea that, the capacity to deepen the experience of a conspiracy theory, for instance, didn't exist when people had to write letters to each other instead of and so this is the big change and the big shift and the big problem that we're dealing with. I think that part of it is, yes, people, if I was advising Democrats, show up more places, show up everywhere, try to have conversations. But I also think that what the right understands about this ecosystem that the left has been slow to understand is that their conversations usually begin about something other than politics. I was talking to a couple people about this right before we started, but essentially, Joe Rogan is not a political podcaster. He's a UFC stand-up comedian with a popular podcast who occasionally talks about politics. Logan Paul, Theo Vaughn, all these guys, and they're almost all guys. It's sports, it's culture, it's MMA, it's something other than politics. And then it evolved into politics over time, crypto, whatever the thing is. And Democrats, it's we have some politics conversations, and then there are these other spaces. And I think we have to kind of, when I say Democrats, I just mean the political party. I basically just mean more people, need to go into different spaces. And, I'd be really interested in, as an NBA, I'm just gonna take basketball because there's a lot of really good NBA podcasts, show up there, and talk about, by the way, and talk about basketball. This is the other thing, and this is me criticism of Democrat politics. They go on these podcasts and then they give them talking points about like the middle class. And it's like, no, you're supposed to go on and talk about basketball for 40 minutes. And then for 5 minutes at the end, you talk about something else. Obama intuitively got this. He used to do this all the time. Our most successful communication for the ACA signups, literally in terms of signups among young people, was he went on Between Two Ferns with Zach Galifianakis. And he didn't talk about signing up for the ACA at all until after he had a really funny appearance in that. At the end, he's like, and I want everybody to sign up. And so the point is that, like, we need to take the political conversation and, in a strange way, move it to the back of the line and just show up in more cultural spaces. Because Americans don't share a culture anymore. Like, when I grew up, everybody like watched the same movies and listened to the same music and, watched the same, everybody watched like TGIF. Is anybody else the late Gen Xer enough to remember that? Like, that doesn't exist anymore. So you kind of have to rebuild a common culture. Get curious about some of this stuff. I mean, not like some racist podcasts, but I mean, like, there's some, I can find something interesting in Theo Vaughn, so I do think we have to just kind of expand and enlarge the places where we're showing up, the conversations we're having. And weirdly, before we can talk about politics, we have to remember how to talk about other things.
I think that's so right. I often think about the food pyramid in the same way that I think about our information diet. I think of our food diet. And if you only ate from one layer of the food pyramid, you'd be enormously unhealthy.
Can I give one other example on the Cuba? So the first time I met with the Cubans, as the highest ranking White House official to meet with the Cubans in a long time, decades. And I was meeting with Alejandro Castro, Fidel Castro's nephew, Raul Castro's son. And the first 3 hours, he gave me a speech about all the horrible things the United States had done. Bay Pigs invasion, tried to assassinate Fidel Castro, and all this subversion. And by the way, most of it was true, And I'm like, oh, this is going to be a pretty tricky negotiation. And I was like, I'm not going to argue about that. I'm not here to talk about that. And then we broke, and we're standing there nibbling like sandwiches, and we started to talk about like baseball, because the Cubans like baseball. And they're like, oh yeah, Cespedes is on the Mets. And then we talked about like food, and we made friends talking about things other than politics. So that when we returned to the conversation about politics, we had developed a relationship as human beings, right, that made it easier to talk about politics. And weirdly, in this country, we've got it backwards. Like, we're only talking about politics. That's an insane way to try to get along with people. It doesn't work. Think of your family. Like you kind of don't want your uncle to talk about politics at Thanksgiving. You'd rather talk about the Knicks, and then maybe at the end of the night you say like, So I think this is basic human behavior stuff.
Yeah, I think that sounds right. And I was just curious, by show of hands, does that sound right, that you want to connect as humans first and then as political actors second? Like this, that just sounds, that feels right. That feels right. It feels true. And we've known it from our own lived experience that sometimes we don't lead with politics, but that's kind of become a culture to live that way. And I think that's a really great point, and perhaps a good point for us to think about, because Washingtonians are, I don't know, notoriously is perhaps not the right word, but famously punctual. So as we approach the end of the hour here, I just want to see if there's any concluding thoughts you want to leave us with, Ben, about advice you have for podcasters, advice you have for us who are experiencing what we're experiencing as Americans living through Trump 2.0, for better or for worse. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think that in keeping with the theme that this is a disruptive moment and we're going to have to get through, but then there's opportunity, for podcasting, for politics, for public speaking, like advice I always give is from a lot of trial and error. So there's a lot of error behind this. So I'm saying this with humility. It took me forever. I'm still working on it. But, what I realized is obviously what people don't gravitate to expertise. They gravitate to authenticity, right? In politicians, but I also think in podcasters. Like, say what you will about some of the people I name checked, they're pretty authentic people. There's not another Joe Rogan. He is who he is. And so for the podcasting advice I give is truly be yourself and actually use the podcast to figure out a little bit more of who you are. Right? Because the other thing I always tell people about public speaking is don't tell people what you think. You have to tell people why you think that. Like, why do I believe this? Like, why is this the right answer? What in my personal experience, what in my background, what anecdote, what thing makes me believe this? And to kind of end on like a meta note to that sense, like we all should be, whatever your politics are, and you can disagree with 90% of what I said. But I do think we're going through, like, even if you like Trump, like this is not normal. Like, and that's actually why they elected Trump, right? And so we should all be thinking about, at core, like not just winning an argument about tax policy or foreign policy or whatever the thing is, like really be thinking about, and I've tried to do this on foreign policy and it's really changed my views. If you listen to podcasts, you might be able to hear a little evolution. But like, what do I actually believe? Like, what do I think this country actually is? Good, bad, and ugly. Like, why do I care to have an opinion about it? You know, I think we all have to kind of check our first principles again, in a way that we haven't before, you know, because we are going to go through some stuff here as a country. Even if you like it, it's going to be different. And when you go through something like that, I think you really need to know kind of what that motivation is that you have. What is going to inform a decision you make to either maybe stand up or not, or to say something or not, or when to say something or what to say, right? Like, where is that going to come from? Not just how am I going to sound smart on my podcast, or like, why am I here? Like, why am I speaking into this microphone? You know, and that, I think that's an opportunity for people to really, and again, maybe I'm too California now, but to kind of figure out who you are, right? Like to figure out, like, not just, again, what you believe, but why you believe it. Because when you're pressure tested like this, like you're going to need that depth, and people can hear it. Like you can hear it on the podcast. Like, is this person being authentic, or is this person just kind of like spout opinions and facts at me? You know,
I think that's great parting advice, and thank you for it. I do want to thank the folks at the USC Capitol campus, Sydney, Felicia, Elise. Thank you for hosting us here today. From the Democracy Group, I want to thank Brandon and Jenna and Chris for even hosting this conference and allowing this discussion to take place. And of course, big thank you to Stephanie. If you haven't listened to her podcast, you must. And of course, to Ben Rhodes. Ben, thank you so much. I'll see you back in LA. Thanks for coming tonight.